So tonight we're going to start the book of Mark, kind of give you the questions we kind of gave you in the reading program just so we can kind of look at those, and then, like I said, I'll try to pull some of those pieces out as we get through. First one, we just talked about what stands out to you and how Mark writes his gospel. How is Mark, what makes it different from some of the other ones? We'll look at some of those things. We also said that there are 18 miracles in Mark's gospel showing Jesus' power and compassion, and so we're going to highlight each of those as we kind of go through it tonight. They're kind of front-loaded in the first half of the book because once you get later on to the end, it's like just a little bit of time that he spends a large portion of his gospel. I think it's like, off the top of my head, I think it's like 40% of his gospel is on the last week and following, and so a lot of this stuff is front-loaded in the first half, so we'll get through quite a bit of the 18 that we see in the gospel. And then Mark was written primarily to a Roman or Gentile audience. Where do you see examples of this? We're not going to get too much into this tonight, but there's just a couple things we'll highlight that maybe help us see what's going on there. And some of that will be some of the differences in how Matthew wrote, because Matthew's writing to a different audience than Mark is. And so even stylistically, those things will come up there. If you were to look, well, let's do this first. We'll kind of give you an overview of the gospel. Mark is the shortest of the four gospels. You should feel very accomplished as you get through it because you're like, bam, 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 like one thing is happening after another. It's super quick-paced. He'll use the word immediately, at least in my translation, like a lot. And if you weren't tracking and like comparing it with like maybe one of the other gospels, you would think that Jesus is like ping-ponging around, like this happened and this happened, and the whole thing takes place over like 2 weeks because of how fast he writes it. But it's part of it's to show Jesus' selfless servant attitude and how he's always hopping from one thing to the next, helping people in this. Mark will show that Jesus, again, is this selfless servant, freely giving of himself to others. And he gives us a model for how to help, how to step into other people's lives in that way. If you were to get the theme of Mark, the theme verse kind of comes from chapter 10, verse 45. We won't get there tonight, but it says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." And so you'll see that throughout the book where Jesus is constantly giving of himself and pouring himself out for others. If you talk about the author, right, Matthew was the author of the book of Matthew. It's a little easier. Mark was written by a guy we think named John Mark, not Mark. John Mark we meet in the book of Acts. You meet him in Acts chapter 12. He's in part of the meeting place in Jerusalem. He's in Peter's house at one point. Apparently Peter went on and kind of knew John Mark. We think actually that the gospel is Peter's account written by John Mark. And so it's the perspective of Peter, written by John Mark. So it's a little different than some of the other ones. He was the cousin of Barnabas. So Paul and Barnabas, right? The first missionary journey. He was Barnabas' cousin, and John Mark went with them on that first missionary journey. If you read through that, though, they get to like their first stop, and John Mark's like, "I'm out," and he leaves. Later on, he comes back into the picture, and Barnabas is like, "Hey, we should bring him back on." And there's a division that's caused between Barnabas and Paul on whether or not to bring John Mark back with them. Barnabas means son of encouragement, so he's like, "Yeah, bring him back in, give him a second chance." And Paul's like, "I'm going on," and that's where they split, right? And Barnabas then goes on with John Mark, and Paul goes off with Silas on the second missionary journey. They'll come back around later, though. He's a close associate of Peter. You kind of see that in 1 Peter 5:13. Peter refers to him as my son, possibly because he was a convert of Peter's. And you'll see him come up later on. I'm trying to look where Paul references him again here. Paul wrote about Mark when he was in his Roman imprisonment, so he'll write about him in Colossians 4 and Philemon. And so Paul kind of reconciles that relationship later on with him. And in 2 Timothy 4:11, he's said to be useful in ministry, according to the Apostle Paul. It's believed that Mark is the first gospel written. So if you were taking them chronologically, a lot of people think Mark was the first one written, and then Mark becomes the primary source for those synoptic gospels. So that would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So Mark writes first, then Matthew and Luke get a hold of that and use that as one of their main sources for compiling their own gospels. It makes sense for Luke, because Luke says, I'm trying to get you an orderly account, so he's gathering all these things together. And so that's where we think kind of this comes from. And so you'll see things, a lot of what's in Mark we've already read in Matthew. There'll be little different flavors of some of those things as we go through it, but there'll be a lot of similarities in there. If you were to break the book down, there's kind of 5 pieces that I see. There's your introduction there in chapter 1, verse 1 through 20. It's super short. This is what Matthew took like 3.5 chapters to say. Mark does it in like 20 verses. So like he just condenses everything down and says it super quick. Then instead of being arranged thematically, kind of like how Matthew was, Mark's kind of arranged geographically. And so the way Mark has it is in Mark 1:21 through 8:26, Jesus is in the region of Galilee. And I'll show you a map there so you can kind of see what's around there. But all of that's taking place in that one general area. There's a couple different towns and stuff that are there, and we'll look at that in a second. But he's in Galilee. Chapter 8, verses 27 through 10:52, he is on his way to Jerusalem. And so here you get a greater revelation of who he is to the disciples. You get things like the transfiguration that we got in Matthew, on the way to Jerusalem. And then chapter 11 through 16:8 is his time in Jerusalem. It's that last week, right? The triumphal entry, the dealing with the religious leaders, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Then the last little bit of your book, which we'll get into probably in 2 weeks, maybe next week, we'll see. Those last verses 9 through 20, some people think is a later addition. We'll get into why they think that and what changes. How does that change the ending of the story if you end on verse 8 instead of verse 20? And so we'll look into that. So those are the 5 kind of big pieces. With some of those pieces, at least the ones in the middle, there's kind of a question that you could associate with what he's trying to cover there. In Galilee, he's trying to say, who is Jesus? Who is this Messiah? In verse 1 of Mark, you'll kind of get his answer, and it's like the only time that he really gives his input on what's going on. And it's like right there at the beginning. He's like, oh, by the way, this is who Jesus is, and then here's how I'm going to answer that question through partway through chapter 8. On the way, it means, what does it mean that Jesus is this Messiah? If the answer comes in chapters 1 through 8, then he's kind of saying, okay, what does that mean if this is the answer? And then chapter 11 through 16 is that suffering servant. It's that kind of the final days of Jesus' life here on earth. And so I think our reading took us through chapter 5. I was trying to get further because of where the days land, and so I got through chapter 6. And so I will have you prepped for tomorrow. I was hoping to get up to that on the way piece and get through the first half of chapter 8. It did not happen. And so we're going to get through chapter 6 today, and then we'll deal with the next chunk when we get here next week. So again, the introduction is super fast, right? He has what I would say the servant is identified. This is John the Baptist. And he, again, first gives his answer there in verse 1. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so he just comes right out the gate. This is who he is. And then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time explaining who that is through these different narrative pieces. So the servant identified is then talking about John the Baptist, his appearance there. John the Baptist does not have as prominent a role in this book as he does in Matthew. You'll see later on that when John has passed away, right? Mark's talking about it in past tense. He's saying, oh, by the way, Herod thought this was happening about Jesus, and then he tells a story about how John passed away before. And so he's not as quite a big in the book as he is in Matthew. And so that's just the beginning, kind of the identification of the servant. He then goes straight into the temptation there in verses 9, 10, and 11. So again, what Matthew took much longer to say, he says super duper quick. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, which is important, right? Because we're talking about that's where he's going to be located for the majority of this ministry piece, and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being opened up, torn open, and the Spirit descended on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." So the identification, that's the end of the identification of the servant. The Spirit then immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So 2 verses, right? Matthew gives you like temptation 1, temptation 2, temptation 3, the quotation. He gives you this whole big deal, and Mark's like, he was here, and then he was here, and then the next thing is Jesus begins his ministry. Now, the verse that Mark uses is very similar to kind of what Matthew said, right? Matthew, remember, says, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Mark says something similar here. He says, now, in verse 14, this is where Jesus begins his ministry. "Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, 'The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel.'" It's all the same pieces. He just shuffled the order around, or I guess Matthew shuffled the order around if Mark wrote before he did. And so you get the same kind of message there. He then calls his first disciples, and so like you can see, it's going super quick. "Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he said to Simon Andrew," and so he calls these 2 brothers, and they follow him. Then he calls James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, and calls them to follow him. And that's really the beginning. That's the opening piece. Those first 20 verses, he kind of flies through that. Next, we get into the region of Galilee. Again, this is almost all the stories here that Mark's going to pull together are going to be in this region of Galilee. You can kind of see a map there. This is a bigger kind of blown out picture, so you can kind of look at that a little bit. Galilee is that grayish purple region up towards the top there. And then Jerusalem, where he will end up, is down there at the bottom, just above where it says Judea. And so those are the 2 geographic locations that are primarily going to be taking place in this. We kind of zoom in a little bit here on the region of Galilee, and you can kind of see places like Nazareth. You can see Capernaum, the Gennesaret. Bethsaida is just outside of that. And so when you see all these different words, he's still talking about this one broad region, right? But this is where Jesus is throughout. There's a better look there. And so that grayish purple region is where Jesus is going to spend the majority of the book of Mark up until chapter 11 when he starts heading towards Jerusalem. So start heading away there. So you'll see him go to different places, but know that it's all in the same region. It's all in Pasco County still, even though it's in Hudson or Trinity or wherever. And so you kind of see him hop around places, but it's still broadly the same place. So we get into the next section here. This is Galilee, talking about who is this Jesus. It's kind of interesting to me. It seems like Mark has a lot more emphasis on Jesus' interaction with demonic forces and kind of that side of it, more so than maybe Matthew did. And the first thing that you get, the first miracle that you get there, is a demon-possessed man who's in the temple, out of all places, which is interesting to me. And then they came into Capernaum, which is in Galilee, and the word immediately shows up, and it will continue to show up a whole bunch. I have, in verses 21 through 34, I have 3 times that I see the word immediately. And so Mark's going to use this word a lot. So again, Jesus is like ping-ponging from one place to another throughout this. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and they were astonished at his teaching. That phrase will come up too a lot. This over and above reaction of the people to Jesus' teaching, to his works, what he's doing throughout the book. "For he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes." Sounds a lot like what he said at the end of the Sermon on the Mount that Matthew then takes and puts there. "And immediately," again, there's 4, I missed one. "And there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know you are the Holy One of God. Again, there's 18 miracles throughout Mark. There's a couple different types of miracles that you'll see. You'll see this removal of unclean spirits or demon possessions, right? You'll see healings that happen, and then there's different ways that happen. Sometimes Jesus won't say anything; it'll just happen, right? Like the lady who's has the issue of bleeding, she just touches Jesus' cloak and is healed. He didn't say anything; he didn't do anything in that sense, right? There'll be sometimes where he just uses a word. There's sometimes where he just uses a gesture, or he touches their hand or something, and they're healed. And so there's physical healings, there's spiritual healings, all these different things that are happening. Verse 25, but Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit convulsed him, and crying out with a loud voice came out of him. And they were all amazed. So they questioned among themselves, saying, "Who is this?" That's kind of our question for this section, right? A new teaching with authority. So again, bouncing off what he just said, he's teaching with someone with authority, and then Jesus exercises that authority by exorcising a demon. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey. And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all of the surrounding region of Galilee. And so you'll see that happen a bunch. There's a couple times where Jesus was like, "Hey, don't tell everybody who I am," because you'll see what will happen is he becomes so popular that he can't even minister there in some places. There's times where, we'll get later on, there's such a big crowd, he's got to go out in a boat because he can't even stay on the shore. He's going to get trampled. There's another time he's trying to eat dinner, and like people are flooding the house, and his family's getting upset because he can't even have a meal because all these people are coming to him. And so again, you see this idea of Galilee there kind of at the end. His fame is spreading in this region. He heals Mary here. This is the second miracle there, and then he heals many. So there's kind of two things that are happening here. A lot of these miracles, a large portion of them are towards individuals. There are some that are bigger than that, right? The feeding of the 5,000 is not one person, but a lot of them is healing one person or helping to get the demon out of one person, as far as how Mark kind of organizes these stories. So again, immediately this happens. That happens, and then verse 32, that evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So you see Jesus having power over the spiritual world there. You see Jesus having power over the physical world. Later you see Jesus having power over nature. You have kind of his identification here in word and deed. This is in 35 to 39. And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place and there prayed. You'll see this happen a couple times too, where Jesus is trying to get away. That word desolate place is even used after the 5,000, right? So Jesus, we'll see in a little bit, he sends out the 12 to minister. They come back with their report, and he's like, let's go to a desolate place and get away and pray. So they're trying to recharge from having a day of ministry. While that's happening, 5,000 plus people show up and want, dinner. He does that, and then Jesus sends the disciples away, and he goes to a desolate place again and goes on the mountaintop and prays throughout the evening. So you'll see that. Verse 36, and Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, everyone is looking for you. And he said to them, let's go on to the next town, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So you have kind of word and deed kind of going on there, right? You have, I'm going to preach the gospel, and I'm going to verify my message through these miraculous signs. When you get to, again, the setting of the 12, we'll look at those same ideas, the preach, the casting out demons, the healing, all of that will come up in how he talks to them and commissions them when they go out 2 by 2. He cleanses the leper there in 40 through 45. This is the third miracle. So every time we have one of those little red dots, that's our miracle. So 1, 2, 3, just in these opening verses. Let's read this real quick so we can kind of see some of these things that come up. And the leper came to him, imploring him and kneeling, and said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was clean. And Jesus sternly charged him to send him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So he's saying, don't tell people what happened, because when you do that, it gets out of hand, and then I can't come into the town. So Jesus is now having to, in some cases, be on the outskirts of the town, because he can't even go inside because of the popularity that he's getting. He heals the paralytic there in chapter 2, 1 through 12. Verse 6 is where you see the first introduction of these scribes and the Pharisees, right? These different religious classes. This is the first kind of opposition that he's going to face from those religious leaders. I think we had someone email kind of asking what's the difference between a scribe and a Pharisee, and there's Essenes, and there's Herodians, and there's Zealots, and there's all these different like religious classes and stuff, what's going on. And those things mean different. When he interacts with them, there's different things that are happening on there. So we'll get into that next week, because once he gets into Jerusalem, more of those things will happen. But this is the first introduction of kind of that confrontation that he's getting with the religious people here in verses 6 and 7. So this is the healing of the paralytic who's dropped down through the roof, right? Matthew mentioned this, but he doesn't mention some of the details of this. So again, similar stories, but not all the details, and they're kind of different in each one, depending on what they're trying to emphasize. Jesus here uses the physical healing of the paralytic to show that he has the authority to also do the spiritual healing, and so he's using these physical miracles as authentication that he has other powers as well, as he goes throughout there. Again, verse 12, and the guy rose up and immediately picked up his bed and went out before them, so that they were all amazed, and they glorified God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." He calls Levi. He starts collecting tax collectors there in 2:13 through 17. Again, the religious leaders get upset with him. Why are you eating with these tax collectors and sinners? And those who are well need no physician, he says, but those who are sick I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. And so you're beginning to see kind of this pushback from the religious leaders in that. You have celebrating what's new here. This is in 18 through 22. Maybe yours says questions about fasting. And he'll basically say, if you knew who I was, right? Fasting was a sign of mourning, and according to the Old Testament, Leviticus 16:29 says that you're supposed to fast as an act of repentance and mourning in conjunction with the Day of Atonement. That's the one day that you're commanded to fast. But the religious leaders had this practice where they would fast on Mondays and they would fast on Thursdays. You see that in Luke 18:12, where he say, you fast twice a week, right? You tithe half of your dill and your cumin, that same passage we talked about, right? You're adding these extra things, but you're neglecting the other things. That's the context of what's going on. And so they would fast other times. So the religious leaders are getting upset with him for not following their added laws. And Jesus is like, look, if you knew who I was, you wouldn't be fasting as a sign of mourning. You would be celebrating that your Messiah has finally come. When I'm gone, then there'll be time for fasting. But I'm here. And so he kind of condemns them for that there. And then he talks about the new and the old, the new covenant and the old covenant. and the inability to kind of mix those two things. That'll come up later in Acts and some other places, but he talks about how you can't take new wine and put it in old wineskins because as it ferments, it produces gas, and then this thing bursts. If you patch your clothes with new unshrunk fabric, then when you wash it, it shrinks and the tear continues to go. Right? And so he's talking about the mixing of these new and old things here. You have the Lord of the Sabbath, again, these different things that they're upset with him about. This is in 23 through 28. And then you have the man with the withered hand. This is the fifth kind of miracle through here. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. So they just had this discussion about, why are you doing these things on the Sabbath? He's like, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and then he's going to heal this guy on the Sabbath. And so they were looking to see if there was a way that they could accuse him for this. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill it? But they were silent, because often when Jesus asks these religious leaders questions, they don't have a good answer, because they're either affirming what he's saying or they're condemning themselves in the answers they give. So they just stay silent. Whose message was John's from? Was it from man or was it from God? Same kind of thing, right? Is this something from God? Well, then you better act. You better, shape up. If it's from man, then you're going to have to fight the people because you're worried about what the people think about you. So again, they're silent here, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So again, Jesus here heals the man. He never even touches it, right? He just tells him to stretch out his hand, and the healing happens through his command, right? And then things escalated super quick, right? Remember Matthew, it's like this kind of slower boil. He's had like 3 interactions, and they're like, we're done. Like, we're looking to destroy you. We're in chapter 3. By this time, Matthew hasn't even gotten through Jesus' temptation yet. Like, Jesus hadn't even started ministry, and like things are going super quick, and Jesus is already hated by these religious leaders after just a couple questions that they can't answer. His popularity continues to grow. In verses 7 through 12, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed him. Great crowds keep happening. That thing keeps coming up. From Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idonium, and from beyond the Jordan, and from the area of Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. So we have that phrase, like from the 4 corners, like all over the place, right? People are hearing what's going on because Jesus, again, is primarily in Galilee. And so this message is going all over the place. And now they're all coming to Jesus. And he just told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many. And so again, this is the idea of Jesus the servant, right? He's coming to bring newness, to bring life. And he continues to help them. And it's interesting, Mark puts these stories back to back, right? So you have the religious leaders who just said they're looking for a way to destroy him because he's breaking the Sabbath, according to their understanding of it. And so they're looking to destroy him. The next section is about the crowd of people who are at least somewhat receptive to Jesus, maybe in a more material, personal way, right? Not necessarily in a spiritual sense, but they're at least open enough that they're bringing enough people that they're getting to crush him from all of these different towns and areas. And so he kind of juxtaposes these two views right next to each other. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down and cried out, "You are the Son of God." Again, that's Mark's opening statement, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. Why? Because he can't even talk to them because he's getting crushed because of the popularity that's happening. He chooses the 12 here. And remember, I told you part of Jesus's kind of outline here a little bit earlier in chapter 1, verses 39, where it talked about he went through all of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out demons. This happens again here, verse 13. And he went up to the mountain and called those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and they might be sent out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. Those same two things that he mentioned previously in the book. Again, it's interesting because who is the first one that he lists? Peter. Probably because it's Peter's account, or maybe because Peter was one of the more prominent characters amongst the group. And then he kind of ends that with talking about Judas Iscariot, who would betray him. So he kind of gives you his identity straight out on who Judas is there. And then they went home, and the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. And when his family heard of it, they went out to seize him, and they were saying, he is out of his mind. And so again, he is getting out of hand, right? He's having a hard time ministering because there's so many people coming to him. You have I just titled, I'm trying to be, I don't know, smart. There's power, I titled it Power Swap, right? And it's the idea of blaspheming the Holy Spirit, right? Where they're identifying what Jesus is doing through the power of the Holy Spirit with the devil's power, and kind of how they're crossing those things and they're getting it wrong. This is sometimes called the unpardonable sin, and I think this kind of gets people hung up. The way, when I was kind of looking this up for tonight, the way kind of put it together is if a person persistently, according to verse 30, attributes to Satan what is accomplished by the power of God, and they make a flagrant, willful, decisive judgment that the Spirit's work and testimony is not his work but of the devil, that is something that will not be forgiven. People get stuck on that, right? But if you're asking the question, if you ever ask, am I guilty of that? That is, in essence, a proof that you're at least receptive enough to ask yourself the question if you're guilty of it. So the answer is no, right? Those who continue to attribute these negative things to Christ aren't forgiven. And this is not a, let me put it this way. Peter denied Christ 3 times and was still an apostle. Apparently wasn't guilty of this. The Apostle Paul is going out and giving thumbs up to people being murdered, and yet is miraculously saved. Right? So this is somebody who is continually, repetitively unrepentant, who is they're not accepting Christ, and it's beyond like, I don't accept you. If you attribute the things of God to the devil, that's another level beyond that. And so that's kind of the power swap there in verses 22 through 30. He then goes into what called a DNA test. This is 31 through 35. And his mothers and his brothers came, and standing outside, they said to him and called to him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. If you remember this, kind of the same kind of story was in Matthew. And he answered them, you are my brother. Who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For everyone who does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. So those who follow Christ, those who are obedient to him, that's who's in the family. That should be no shock to you, because when you get into the epistles, that's the same kind of thing that happens, right? First John talks a lot about this. James will talk a lot about this. And so that's kind of who's in the family. Then you have this section of parables here. Not quite as many as Matthew has. He only has a few. But this is the majority of chapter 4. There's one other story kind of at the end, but the majority of chapter 4 is these different parables. The parable of the sower, the purpose of the parables, he kind of lays it out just like Matthew does, kind of in between, and then he gives the explanation. So it's the same kind of framework, right? Here's the parable. The disciples are like, what are you talking about? And then he gives the reason for the parables, and then he explains what that parable is. He talks about the parable of the lamp. We'll look at that in a second. That one's kind of exclusive to Mark, if I am remembering it right. Yeah, Mark is the only place where that one appears. You have the parable of seed growth. That's the mustard seed that we saw in Matthew, the seed growth, and then you have the mustard seed, which are very similar in kind of how they work out. So the parable of the lamp, since that's kind of the new one. And he said to them, a lamp is brought in to be put, is a lamp brought in to be put under a basket or under a bed, and not on a stand? For nothing is hidden except to be manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. And if anyone has an ear to hear, let him hear. And he said to them, pay attention to what you hear. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and still more will be added to you. For the one who has more will be given, and for the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Jesus in this second part here is talking about this measurement thing, another thing that I think people get confused on. What he's saying is those who embrace the message of the kingdom, because all of these parables are about the kingdom, right? The first one's about the seed, and he explains all that, right? Those who accept it. He explains the parable of the lamp. That's all about the kingdom, right? You don't hide these things, right? And the measurement we'll get to in a minute. The seed growth, and the mustard seed. All of these are in the framework of the kingdom. And so what he's saying here is those that embrace Jesus' message of the kingdom will be given more of what they want, right? If you're saying, I want Jesus, I want to know who he is, I want to understand him, those who have that desire, who are the good seed that grows up and flourishes, right? Those people will be given more and more of that. Those people who don't have that, even what they have will be taken away. Those who reject God and the message will lose it all. Is kind of the idea behind that. The lamp is not in the older one. The lamp is in other places. The seed growth, I misspoke there, 26 through 29 is the only one that's in Mark. So if you wrote in your Bible or made a note, erase it, cross it out because I said it wrong. The 26 through 29 is exclusive to Mark, not the previous one. And he said, the kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground, which sounds similar to a different one we looked at. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, and he knows not how. The earth produces by itself first the blade and then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. It's interesting when Jesus is like, those who have the kingdom understand these things. And then you read commentaries and they're like, here's 4 different ways you can interpret this one. And maybe that's because it's only in Mark that there's some division on how this lays out. One understanding for this parable is that it's talking about the whole of God's kingdom, which will start out small, and as it grows and grows and grows, eventually the harvest happens, which some see as the final judgment, right? So there are some who will say this is like of an individual, right? And so your spiritual life, but others will say it's a broader thing talking about the kingdom itself, because that's the context of the whole thing is the kingdom, right? The seed is growing in the kingdom, and so this is the same kind of thing here. The parable of the mustard seed, again, it's the contrast of this smallest of the garden seeds, and it becomes the tallest of the garden plant. In my mind, this is like the difference between like a poppy seed and like a sunflower seed, right? This is like this little thing, like you're like, what does this little thing do? And it grows up into this giant plant, and the mustard plant would grow very quickly and would grow 12 to 15 feet high. Like it's not like a little plant, and it comes from this tiny little seed. The idea here is the insignificant beginning of God's kingdom, especially embodied in the presence of Jesus, would start out small and unexpected, but would continue to grow into this large tree that provides shade for all. Verse 33, with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything. So Matthew says the same kind of thing, right? Matthew gives you a little bit of the reasoning why, right? They're rejecting him, so he's like, all right, fine, I'm going to withdraw physically, and I'm going to speak in parables, so I'm going to withdraw intellectually, and I'm not going to give you straight teaching anymore. I'm going to give you parables. So he kind of gives you that little bit kind of right there at the end, but it's the same kind of thing, right? Where he's in public now, he's going to be talking in parables versus these more explicit teachings, and then he'll go to the disciples and explain to them privately kind of the interpretation there. Sometimes it'd be nice if he explained more than just the first one to us, because I think we kind of understand the first one, but maybe Mark should have added a couple more verses and given us the explanation to these other ones, as they can be a little challenging sometimes to understand. The sixth miracle here is a little bit of a different one. Jesus calms the storm. And so a lot of the ones we've seen are like removing, like exorcising demons or healing withered hand, or these people with different issues. Now Jesus calms the storm in verses 35 through 41. So again, this demonstrates his power over nature. So power over the spiritual realm, power over the physical realm, power over nature. As we continue to answer, who is this Jesus? And then that's kind of the exact question they ask in verse 41. And they were filled with great fear, and they said to another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obeys him? Matthew 5 is the healing of the demoniac. This is the seventh miracle. This story is also in Matthew 8. We read this story. If you remember in Matthew, though, there's 2 demon-possessed men. In Mark, there's 1. And if you remember in Matthew, it seemed like Matthew is more focused in on the response of the crowd to what Jesus had done, right? He tells them how everyone came in and they saw what happened, like, we don't want any part of this, you need to get out of here. And so they asked Jesus to leave. Mark will say the same thing, but his focus seems to be on the healing of the demoniac, not on the crowd. And so he's only going to talk about one of the 2. The other chance for this, another way maybe happens is, we gave this example last time. Jesus heals 10 lepers. 1 leper comes back and thanks him. Jesus maybe heals 2 demoniacs, and one of them has a different response than the other. And so he's going to focus on the one character that has the response that he's going to write out here. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, who he's going to come to later. And when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately there met a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Again, Jesus, the first miracle he does in the book is healing the demon-possessed person in the temple. This happens here again, so showing his power over the spiritual realm. This, to me, is a good example of where Jesus cares deeply for the people that we think are too far gone, right? This guy has been abandoned by society, right? He's been chained up. You'll see later that he's cutting himself with shards of pottery and stuff. He's naked, because later they'll say he's clothed in his right mind, which means he wasn't clothed before, right? And so this is the person that nobody wants anything to do with. And yet Jesus, this selfless, sacrificial servant, is willing to meet them. No one had enough strength to subdue him, and night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran up and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." it's always interesting that like the demons are like, whoa, I didn't know you were coming today. Welcome. I don't want any trouble. I'm just kind of hanging out, right? There's always kind of the attitude like, what do you want to do with me? Have you come to destroy me now? Which means they know what's coming, and they're like, oh, is that today? I didn't know that was today. Are you sure it's today? And so there's this back and forth with Jesus. They say, hey, there's a bunch of us. There's not just one. Our name is the Legion. And he says, they say, hey, can we go into the pigs over there instead? And verse 13, it says, so he gave them permission, which I think is great because like they're having to like grovel before him. And then he's like, yeah, sure, whatever, just get out of here. They go over there, go into the pigs. The pigs then careen off the shore, off this cliff into the water. And some dude is watching his retirement just like crash down into the water and sink. 2,000 pigs at $50. Like, it's not a good day, which is why you can understand why the people asked him to leave after that. But all this happened. The herdsmen, interesting fact too, Jews weren't allowed to eat pigs. So who was hurting the pigs? Gentiles were. And so you have some of that going on here. The herdsmen fled, and they told in the city and the countryside, and people came to see what was happening, because if 2,000 pigs run off the cliff and you don't have Facebook or Instagram, like someone's running into the city because like you're never going to believe what happened to John today. Like it was not, it's good, but it wasn't good. Like you got to come. And so like everyone's rushing out to see what's happening. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from the region. And he was getting into the boat, and the man who had been possessed with the demon begged him that he might go with him. This is why I think Mark picks up on one guy, not the two. Because I think this guy has the right response. I have nothing to prove this, right? There's no other verse that you can show me that shows me I'm right or wrong. But my assumption is the other guy's like, thanks, and then walks away. And something else happens to this guy. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. Even that might be a compassion, like you've been away in the tombs. Go see your wife if you had one, right? Go see your kids, go see your parents, go to your family and tell your family what God's done for you. And so before he sends the 12 out, it's like he sends this guy to the Gerasenes and he sends him over there. It's kind of the one time where it seems like he's not telling them to be quiet, right? He tells this guy to go and like, you can go ahead. And when he went away, he began to proclaim in Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So Jesus told him, one verse before, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. And then if you draw a line, he says, he went to Decapolis and how much Jesus had done for him. So somewhere he's connecting the lines, at least to me, that Jesus is Lord, because Mark's using those two words somewhat interchangeably, because he doesn't say Lord here and Lord here. He says Lord here and Jesus here. So the question is it possible that a demon-possessed man was a Gentile and not a Jewish person? And so that's why some of the other things like the pigs and those type of things, right, in Decapolis. That's a really good question. And I wish I knew. And now that you've asked it, I want to know. Because this story is one of my favorite stories in Mark. One of the first times I preached, I did this message and talked about some of those other things. So I'll have to go back and double check to see if people think that this demon-possessed man was a Jew or a Gentile. And it's interesting that you point out, right, that he's telling the Jewish people, don't talk about me, but this guy, he does. So maybe there's something different there, like a Acts 2 kind of spread moment, right, where these people are going off into these other areas that don't have that. The next two miracles are kind of together. This is in 5:21 through 43. I titled it 2 12s because if you read the story carefully, the one woman has been bleeding for 12 years, and Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. And so I don't know why. Maybe there's significance, maybe there's not. It's just interesting that there's 12 around both of those. He crossed over on the boat to the other side, so he left where he was. He goes to the other side. A great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then he came to the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell on his feet, and he implored him earnestly. That's a very different reaction from every other religious leader that we've been introduced to in Mark thus far. Right? Everyone else is questioning him. They're saying, what is this guy talking about, the Sabbath? Right? This is the one guy so far of this Jewish ruling class, right, who's having this positive interaction with Jesus. He asked Jesus to heal his daughter. Jesus says, sure. Well, he's on the way. Guess what happens? Too many people get in the way. They're having a hard time getting to where they're supposed to go. In the midst of that, a woman comes up who's been bleeding for 12 years. This would have made her ritually unclean according to Leviticus 15, 25 through 27, and would have excluded her from normal social relationships. And because of her any contact with the outside world, it would have also made her unclean for synagogue and temple worship. Right, so this one who is religiously ostracized, socially ostracized, is broke because she spent all of her money trying to get help from the doctors, and she's gone from this doctor to this doctor to this doctor, and she has no more money because she's been dealing with this for 12 years. She's walking through the crowd. She touches Jesus' cloak, right? So this is one of those ones where Jesus doesn't say anything, right? He doesn't touch anybody. He doesn't say anything, but yet she's healed. And when you look at the word healing, and when you look at the phrase there in verse 34, one commentator suggested that the wording suggested both a physical and a spiritual healing. So physically healing from her amenities, but also a salvation, a spiritual salvation there as well. So that kind of happens. It's kind of like this interruption in the story. Then, while Jesus is still talking to this lady, Jairus' servants come up and say, hey, your daughter's dead. Don't bother him anymore. He tells Jairus in verse 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the rulers of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And so he goes in, he only allows Peter, James, and John, those three inner circle, to go with him. As he goes in, the people are laughing at him because she's dead. And he's like, no, she's not, she's asleep. And so he goes in, he heals her, and immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. If you read, in the room is only allowed Jairus, his wife, and those three, because he pushed out all those mourners. And he strictly charges them that no one should know this. And so you kind of see how all these pieces are falling together. Like, Jesus is kind of talking and framing the miracle, right, in this one way, pushing these people out, only allowing some people to go in because he can't minister because of being overwhelmed. Jesus is then rejected in Nazareth, which, if you remember, is his hometown. One thing I'll point out, because we've already read this in Matthew and here, they're saying, isn't this, we know this guy. Like, we went to school with him, right? Or had classes together. Like, we know who this guy is. And one little snippet you see in verse 3, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? So he says the son of Mary here. Couple possible explanations for that. First, it's possible that Joseph had already died, and so they're identifying Jesus with his living parent. It's probably more likely that the people in his hometown, because they grew up with him, remember the rumors about his so-called promiscuous birth, right? They weren't married yet, and like it was the talk of the town, right? And so they identify Jesus with Mary because they don't know who his father is, which is still true, right? The whole question is, who is Jesus? And they're still not getting that. And so they're saying, this is the son of Mary, because they think he can't be Joseph's son. We're not sure. But the answer is we still don't know, because if you did, the reaction would be different instead of rejecting him. Jesus then sends out the 12 there in verses 7 through 13. He gives them some instructions, same kind of thing. He sends them out 2 by 2. And then in verse 12, he said, so they went out proclaiming that people should repent. Same kind of thing that he talked about in chapter 1 and in chapter 3. Now he's giving that same idea to the disciples here in chapter 6. And they cast out many demons, and they anointed with oil and were healing, and the sick were healed. And so in Mark 1:35 and Mark 3:14 and 15, these same kind of things come up again. So this is what Jesus' mission was, and now he's commissioning these 12 to go do the same mission. You kind of have this like commercial break in the middle of here, and like the death of John the Baptist comes up. Verses 14 and 15 are like present tense, and then he starts telling a past tense story. So King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. So some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. And you're like, wait a minute, I don't remember John the Baptist dying. This is why these miraculous powers are at work with him. But others said he is Elijah, and others said he is a prophet, like the ones of old. So again, there's a question on who Jesus is. Then starting at verse 16, it gives you, okay, John died, and he tells the backstory of how John died. It's very, very similar story to how Matthew tells it in his gospel. The feeding of the 5,000 there is in verses 30 through 44. But if you remove, like theoretically, let's remove the death of John the Baptist for a minute from the narrative, right? Verse 12, so they went out proclaiming that the people should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick, and they healed them. Verse 30, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And so what's happening now is mission report, right? He adds this weird story, but like what's happening is now they come back and they're saying, hey, this is what happened into the places that you sent us. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. Anyone who's been in ministry, right, anyone who serves, right, knows this feeling. If you serve in food pantry, you know that at 10:50, you're like, it's almost done. And then 20 people wake up, and they show up, and you're like, we need 4 more boxes. And by the time those 4 boxes are done, you're turning around like, we need 4 more boxes. And this is what happens, right? They come back, they're trying to take a break, they're about to sit down for coffee and tell Jesus all the great things that happened, and 5,000 people show up. And they're like, we can't catch a break. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. These guys are hungry, right? They've been working, they come back, and they can't even grab a bite. Jesus couldn't get a bite earlier in his house, same kind of thing happening. And they went out into the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them. They ran there on foot in all the towns and got there ahead of them. So these guys leave in the car, and like the bicycles are passing them and getting there before they are. When they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them. Not because they were hungry, right? The stories of feeding of the 5,000, we always remember the bread and the fishes, right? He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is the suffering servant, right? The one who's always looking out for everybody else. And he's compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus' compassion is for the people's lack of spiritual leadership. Kind of see this in Numbers 27, 2 Chronicles 18, and Ezekiel 34. The phrase without a shepherd is used to describe people as helpless and starving, lacking in spiritual guidance and protection, and exposed to the perils of sin and spiritual destruction. He stops not because they're hungry. He stops because they're spiritually anemic and sick. And so he starts teaching, and they're there so long, then they run out of food. So the point is not the food, but the food does happen. But that's kind of the point. The disciples who are now wiped from having been sent out and thought they were going to get to eat, realize that they've only got 5 loaves of fish, or 5 loaves and 2 fish, or 3 fish, and like, we don't eat 2. They only have 2 fish. They don't even have enough to eat themselves. And like, we didn't even get a bite yet, and he wants to feed these guys. We would need 200 denarii to feed them. That's the equivalent of one day's work. So if you take and you extrapolate it out, if you say one day, $15 an hour, 40 hours at $8 an hour, right, is $120 times 200 is $24,000. He's like, Jesus, we would need $24,000 to go into town to buy bread for these people. You have the miracle where he blesses the food and then feeds the 5,000, and we're going to have to stop there. Because next, he immediately leaves. We'll pick this story up because the next story is attached. The next 2 pieces are all attached. Right, so the sending out of the disciples is immediately attached to the feeding of the 5,000, which is immediately attached to the walking on the water. And that's it. So those 3 pieces are together. So when you read that tomorrow, see if you can, it's kind of like one big story in like 4 episodes, so see if you can kind of find the links to how those all go together, because all of those kind of piece together as they go out.